Hi, my name is Claire Hawthorne, and 3 days ago at my grandfather's will reading, my parents burned the $38 million check he left for me. They didn't shout. They didn't explain. They just lit a match like that was all I ever amounted to. But this isn't a story about money. It's about what happens when the people who raised you try to erase you and you decide not to disappear. It's just a formality, my mother had said. That was her way of saying I wasn't wanted, just needed to be seen losing. The envelope arrived on a Wednesday. Heavy parchment, my name calligraphed in black ink, no return address. Inside, an invitation to the reading of Everett Hawthorne's will, dated November 23, 2023. At the bottom, in Evelyn's handwriting, sharp exact, were 4 words. Formal appearance, expected Claire. I stared at it for a long time, fingers tracing the edge of the card. I hadn't stepped foot inside Hawthorne Manor since the day I was pushed out of the Family Foundation's boardroom, stripped of my position, and left with nothing but a forced smile and a non-disclosure clause. 3 years ago, they'd smiled as they silenced me. Now they were inviting me back, as a formality. I should have thrown it out. Instead, I stood in front of my closet 2 hours before the event, deliberating whether navy or charcoal said I am not here for your approval. I chose black. The drive to Connecticut felt like crossing into a different lifetime. Cold November light filtered through the trees lining the estate. The gates opened without a word, pre-programmed impersonal, and I parked where I used to, when I still believed I belonged. The manor loomed just as I remembered it, Georgian brick ivy trailing the columns like time refusing to let go. A valet took my keys without looking at me. No one met me at the door. Inside, the staff were ghosts. The scent of cedar polish and sharp florals filled the air, Evelyn's signature arrangement. I tightened my grip on the small wooden box in my coat pocket. It was the last thing he'd ever given me. The drawing room had been rearranged, long mahogany table leather chairs at either side. I scanned the space. Evelyn sat at the head, immaculate in dove gray. Robert beside her, posture rigid, eyes forward. Franklin lounged on the right legs, crossed with practiced nonchalance, sipping from a tumbler of scotch like it was a brand deal. No one looked up when I entered. A place had been set at the farthest end. One chair slightly askew like an afterthought. A deliberate one. I walked toward it slowly, every step a reminder that I was being watched. Not with curiosity, but with expectation. Sit down, be quiet, watch us win again. As I took my seat, the door behind me clicked shut. Carlton Reed stepped in, tall, crisp, and carrying a leather folio. His eyes met mine for a moment. Something flickered, caution maybe, but his face remained neutral. "Thank you all for being here," he said. His voice was smooth, practiced. "Mr. Everett Hawthorne's final testament has been lodged and confirmed through probate. As counsel, I'll proceed with the formal reading shortly." He placed the folio in front of Evelyn, who didn't acknowledge him. She merely adjusted her cuff and said, "Let's not draw this out." Robert grunted in agreement. Franklin smirked at me like he was watching a child about to be told Santa wasn't real. I breathed through my nose and said nothing. The room felt colder than it should. Or maybe I was the only one not warmed by inheritance. As Carlton arranged the documents, I let my mind wander back to the boardroom 3 years ago, the day they staged my removal. The vote called by Evelyn under the guise of my emotional instability following Everett's declining health. How Franklin had seconded it with a smirk and Robert refused to look at me. How I was escorted out, my access revoked by the end of the hour. The last thing I heard was my mother's voice behind the closed door. She was never meant for this. Now here I was, sitting at their table again. Carlton began. "Before we proceed, a brief legal disclosure." I heard none of it. Evelyn leaned slightly toward me, her lips barely moving. "Don't expect much," she murmured. He was confused near the end. My eyes didn't leave hers. "Were you with him when he signed it?" Her smile didn't reach her eyes. I made sure everything was taken care of. I turned away before I said something I couldn't unsay. The reading hadn't even begun, and already the air was thick with knives. Carlton continued. His voice was even deliberate, but I felt none of it land. I stared down at the box in my lap. The walnut wood had dulled with age. It clicked open easily, though I didn't open it yet. Not here. Not now. Whatever he left me, if anything, wasn't going to be in that folio. I already knew that. As Carlton closed the document and nodded toward Evelyn, the tension in the room thinned slightly. There was no reaction. No anger. No celebration. Just a quiet assumption the pieces were already in place. As I reached for my coat, Carlton's hand briefly touched mine, a folded corner of paper between his fingers. They didn't scream. They didn't argue. They simply lit a match and thought that was the end of it. The salon at Hawthorne Manor had been transformed into something out of a staged portrait. Golden light diffused through antique sconces, polished mahogany surfaces gleaming under crystal chandeliers, and chairs arranged in a perfect arc around a central table. Everyone sat unnervingly straight, as if posture alone could make the performance more civil. Carlton stood at the center, legal documents spread before him like a ritual. To his right, two unfamiliar faces, bank officials in navy suits, sat silently, their expressions carefully neutral. They were the witnesses I'd learn later. Independent, impartial, unfeeling. To my left, Robert adjusted his cufflinks as if they were more important than anything about to be said. Evelyn smoothed a non-existent wrinkle from her skirt. Franklin leaned back, balancing his chair on two legs, a picture of smug relaxation. Carlton cleared his throat and began. As stated in the formal testament dated September 28th, Mr. Everett Hawthorne bequeaths the following. His voice was calm, professional, every word precise. Franklin straightened slightly when his name was called. To Franklin Hawthorne, Carlton read, "I leave the family's physical holdings, including the lakefront property, all antiques on site, and the vineyard shares." Franklin gave a small nod like he'd expected nothing less. Carlton turned the page. To Claire Hawthorne. I felt the room narrow. Heat pooled behind my ears. I leave a personal cashier's check in the amount of $38 million written from my own account. A gesture of gratitude and faith. There was no pause, no gasp. Just a moment of weighted silence. Then Robert stood. I didn't even notice he had something in his hand until he walked past Carlton and toward the fireplace. The envelope was cream-colored thick. Inside a single sheet, the check. I opened my mouth to speak, but no sound came. Robert held the check between two fingers. He was a romantic, he said to no one in particular. Always thought emotion could replace structure. Evelyn's voice floated in smooth as always. He meant well, but he lost clarity. And then Robert struck a match. He lit the corner like it was a post-it note. The flame caught instantly, curling paper into ash. It flared orange, then white, then shrank embers, eating the edge of what had once been power mine. They didn't scream. They didn't gloat. They just burned it. I didn't look at the flames. I looked at Carlton. He didn't move, didn't speak. But I saw the faintest flicker in his jaw. Not surprise, not outrage, recognition. They thought I'd cry, thought I'd scream. But I did none of it. Instead, I smiled. It wasn't for them. Not for the witnesses or the family I no longer claimed. It was for Carlton. Because in his palm, concealed behind a folded legal pad, was a corner of paper he had slipped into my hand earlier. A letter, maybe. A signal. And they didn't know. The check was almost gone now, burning bright before collapsing into its final useless form. I bowed my head slightly, as if in respect, hands tight around the small walnut box still resting on my lap. It felt heavier now, not in weight, in purpose. No one said a word. The bank witnesses scribbled something and handed Carlton signed forms. Franklin looked bored. "That concludes the reading," Carlton said, finally, voice even. Meeting adjourned. His eyes never left mine. The ink had faded, but the words hit like a gavel. "You are the only one I trust not to burn what matters." I sat cross-legged on the worn velvet rug in my apartment, the walnut box open before me like an altar. Outside, the city murmured beneath a blanket of cold November air, but here, under the muted glow of the brass lamp above my desk, it was just me and him. The letter had been folded in thirds, the edges soft from years of being pressed flat inside the lid. The paper was ivory, faintly scented with cedar, and written in the familiar looping script I hadn't seen since the hospital. He hadn't addressed it with "Dear Claire" or "My granddaughter just began," as if we'd never stopped speaking. "If you're reading this, it means they did exactly what I suspected they would." I read that line again, then again. My fingers trembled as I continued. "I'm sorry they made you watch it burn. They always did love fire, just never knew what to do with the ashes. The check was never the point. That was just paper. The real foundation is elsewhere." I stopped breathing for a moment. 3 months ago, I transferred full legal control of my investment portfolio, intellectual property, and trust holdings into a structure you now manage through Carlton Reed. Enclosed is the certified copy of that contract. The originals are with him. Everything was notarized by someone I trust, Lucille. Lucille, the woman who used to tuck lemon drops into my coat pocket on cold mornings, who sat with me through every flu season while my parents traveled. I hadn't seen her since the memorial service. I thought she'd faded into retirement quietly, but there she was, her name in black ink beneath a line marked "Witness." I asked her to sign because she was the only one left in the house who still called you family. I placed a hand over my mouth, trying to keep the sob down. It wasn't grief. It wasn't even relief. It was something deeper, something I hadn't let myself feel in years. Trust. He trusted me. "Let them destroy the surface," the letter read. "You hold the foundation." I traced the sentence with the tip of my finger over and over, letting it anchor me. I unfolded the second sheet, an official-looking contract with Seal's page numbers and his signature beside Carlton's. The details made my head swim: structured assets, irrevocable transfers, codicils buried in corporate filings. It was dizzying, but beneath all the language was a single truth. They hadn't burned what mattered. They didn't even know what it was. I leaned back, head resting against the edge of my couch, the documents spread across the floor like fallen leaves. For the first time since the boardroom exile, I wasn't thinking about revenge. I wasn't even thinking about Evelyn or Robert, or the expression on Franklin's face when he'd watched the check curl into ash. I was thinking about the way my grandfather used to look at me across the chessboard. The way he always made the first move without saying a word, knowing I would understand. The way he played a long game, not just to win, but to teach me how to win. And he'd just made his last move. My eyes burned. I wiped them, but the tears kept coming. Slow, heavy, soundless. Not from pain. From being seen, truly seen, by someone who never asked me to be smaller than I was. I sat in silence, letting the ink and paper absorb my breath. Eventually, I reached for my phone. The screen lit up with the same number that had called me once after the boardroom vote, then never again. I hit call. He picked up after one ring. "I've been waiting for this call," Carlton said. "I wanted to tell you," Carlton said, his voice brittle. "But your grandfather forbade me until now." The elevator to the 11th floor let out a tired chime before the doors creaked open. Carlton's office was tucked inside a pre-war building on the edge of downtown, the kind with crown moldings, radiators that clanked in protest, and windows that didn't quite shut out the cold. A brass plaque outside read, "Reed and Fellows LLP," though I never saw another soul walk in or out. Inside the office looked like someone had been preparing for an avalanche of paper. Files were stacked in deliberate chaos, tall enough to suggest neglect, but too neat to be accidental. A pair of leather chairs sat opposite his desk, which was half buried beneath folders, newspaper clippings, and legal pads scribbled through with layers of edits. Carlton himself stood at a cabinet drawer, holding a sealed envelope in both hands like it might explode. I stepped inside and closed the door softly behind me. "I got your message." He nodded, jaw tight. "I didn't want you to read that letter alone." I sat, "But you let me." "It was his instruction," Carlton said. "Every part of this, your grandfather orchestrated it meticulously. He even predicted the match. The one they lit?" He gave a wry, humorless smile. "The very one." He slid the envelope across the desk. The seal was already cracked. Inside was the original contract I'd seen the night before now, with embossed legal stamps, signed and countersigned, notarized, date marked August 11th. 2 months before his death. Carlton pointed at the lower margin. "Effective immediately upon signing. Revocable only by Everett Hawthorne or the designated executor. He named you the sole steward. I read the line again. Then a third time. This is airtight. Carlton hesitated. Claire, it's bulletproof. So why didn't you tell me? He looked down then away. He made me swear. Not in writing, in person. Said you had to come to it yourself or it wouldn't mean anything. He didn't want you to act out of spite. I exhaled slowly, letting the heat of that land. And now that they've turned spite into spectacle, I asked. That's why I called you. He opened a drawer, pulled out a worn leather portfolio, and laid it between us. Inside were press clippings about the foundation, about Franklin's newly inherited properties, and an embargoed statement from Robert Hawthorne about assuming stewardship of the Hawthorne legacy. He's scheduled to appear on Vantage with Deborah Knox next week, Carlton said. Live segment, full interview. I stared at the clipped article, Franklin's smug face frozen mid-sentence, his hand raised like he was about to bestow blessings on the people below. They're going to take a victory lap. Carlton nodded. Publicly. What happens, I asked, my voice calm, if I release this contract before that interview? He sat back. They'll scramble. Lawyers will claim mental decline. PR teams will spin it as a clerical error. Franklin will make it a joke. Evelyn will make it war. I considered that for a moment. And if I wait, Carlton leaned forward. They'll show the world their true face. On camera, in real time, without any idea what you hold. I didn't reply. Not immediately. I stood and walked to the window, the glass chilled against my fingertips. From here, the city looked like a scattered deck of cards, flashing, spinning, indifferent. I asked you last night what I could do now, I said softly. They burned that check to humiliate me. In front of you. In front of strangers. Carlton was silent. Well, I asked, turning to him. What do I have the right to do? He didn't blink. Whatever the truth requires. The room was quiet for a beat, then two, and then I laughed. It wasn't a joyous sound. It was sharp and thin and born of something deeper than fury. It was clarity. Then let them crown themselves, I said. It'll be easier to knock it off. Franklin's smile was dazzling. Pity it wouldn't survive the afternoon. The boardroom of the Hawthorne Foundation gleamed under surgical white LED lights, every edge sterilized, every surface cold. A long table of tempered glass stretched across the center, lined with plush leather chairs, each occupied by a face I hadn't seen in years but remembered all too well. The same people who'd voted me out without hesitation, who hadn't bothered to meet my eyes as they signed the motion to relieve Claire of her duties for the good of the organization. I stood in the back this time, a guest, a courtesy, a quiet observer, as the email had labeled me. Franklin sat where I used to at the head of the table. He was dressed in slate gray tailored wool tie, loose enough to look casual, but knotted with precision. Cameras were already rolling. 2 local financial outlets had been invited to document a milestone moment or so, the press release said. He flashed the cameras a grin as the meeting was called to order. Before we begin, he said, hands spread in a gesture of warmth, so artificial it could have been laminated, I want to thank you all. My father, of course, for his constant faith. My mother for her grace. And most of all, the board for your continued trust in this next phase of the Hawthorne legacy. A few polite nods, one smattering of soft applause. He tapped his tablet, and the screen behind him blinked to life, revealing a flowchart Global Expansion Initiative, Phase 1. Another tap, and it shifted to bullet points about overseas holdings investment strategies, philanthropic campaigns. I was fortunate Franklin continued to have been entrusted by our late patriarch with significant responsibility before his passing. It is in that spirit I now propose a formal expansion funded by the liquidation of select dormant assets. He paused dramatically. Assets I have full authority over per our internal succession plan. I glanced toward Carlton, seated along the far wall legal pad resting calmly on his lap. He didn't look at me, but his pen tapped once. Our signal. Point of order, I said, my voice clear, steady. Heads turned. Franklin froze, his eyes narrowing. Claire, he said, tone still warm for the cameras. As mentioned earlier, you're here as a guest. Observers don't... I won't take long. I walked forward, slow and deliberate, and set a manila folder on the glass table in front of him. Since we're speaking about responsibility and succession, I believe this should be part of the conversation. He didn't reach for it. One of the board members, a woman named Harding, leaned forward to peek. What's that? An original notarized contract, I said. Executed by Everett Hawthorne, transferring all legal and financial control of the Foundation's core assets to me, effective August 11th, 2 months before his death. A breath caught somewhere near the end of the table. Flashbulbs popped. A camera shifted toward me. Franklin laughed just once, sharp. That's impossible. I opened the folder and turned it toward him. Your father witnessed it. Carlton Reed executed it. Lucille Barnett notarized it. I have a certified copy from the registrar's office. Would you like to read it aloud? The room fell into silence so deep I could hear the building's HVAC humming above us. Carlton stepped forward and laid a second copy on the table. The documentation has been registered, he said smoothly, legally, irrevocably. Franklin opened his mouth, then closed it again. His jaw worked in tight, silent circles. Behind him, the screen still displayed the phrase, Global Expansion Initiative, in bold blue letters. I placed one hand flat on the table right beside the contract. You burned a check, I said, voice low. I held the deed. Let's talk about legacy. Camera shutters clicked. One board member stood walking to the far end of the table to read the documents for himself. Others followed. Murmurs swelled. Phones buzzed. From the corner of my eye, I saw Carlton watching Franklin not with triumph, but with something closer to pity. But I didn't feel pity. Not yet. Maybe not ever. I had let them speak. Let them smile. Let them crown themselves kings and queens of a dynasty they believed they'd inherited by default. Now all I had to do was tip the crown. He said one day, "You'd come," Lucille whispered, pulling a metal tin from beneath the floorboards. He made me promise. The apartment smelled like lemon polish and thyme. Sunlight poured through lace curtains dancing across hardwood that had known better days. Lucille's place was a small second-story walk-up near the river. Tucked above an antique bookstore she still referred to as his secret hideaway, even though Everett had stopped visiting it years before. I hadn't seen her since the funeral. Her hair was thinner, her hands more lined, but her eyes, those soft, sharp eyes, were the same. They held memory like a weight. He made me promise, she repeated slower this time, like a vow spoken to the air as much as to me. She knelt slowly beside the far corner of the living room and pulled back the edge of a faded rug. Beneath it, a loose floorboard. She lifted it carefully, revealing a rusted tin box that glinted dull silver in the morning light. This isn't just keepsakes, she said. It's everything. I crouched beside her as she opened the lid. Inside were envelopes, 3 sealed in wax, and a small bundle of yellowing pages wrapped with string. At the very bottom, a white handkerchief embroidered with my initials in thread I remembered picking out with him one summer. Under that, nestled like an afterthought, was a USB stick. Silver. Unlabeled. Lucille handed me the first envelope. He wrote it the night he got the diagnosis, she said softly. Said he didn't trust the house staff anymore. Too many eyes, not enough loyalty. I opened the letter with careful fingers. If they try to erase the paper trail, he had written in his looping hand, follow the hands that once carried the truth. The contents were meticulous. A duplicate of his handwritten will, not the one prepared by attorneys, but the one he had drafted himself long before the final revisions. At the bottom was a fingerprint in red ink. Thumbprint. Lucille confirmed it was taken in her presence. Carlton later verified over the phone it was valid under Connecticut estate law. Unusual, he said, but binding. I folded the letter back into its envelope with reverence. Lucille sat across from me now, hands folded in her lap. He wasn't sentimental, your grandfather, but when he spoke about you, Claire, I saw something in him I hadn't seen since he lost your grandmother. I didn't speak. I couldn't. She nodded toward the second bundle. That's for you, too. It was a collection of typed notes bound by a paperclip marked in his handwriting, Observations Legacy Candidates. Each page had a name. Evelyn, Robert, Franklin, and then mine. I scanned his words slowly. For Evelyn, he wrote polished, predictable, power-hungry in a way she believes is noble. Will always protect her version of order no matter the truth it buries. For Franklin, smart but reckless, craves approval, not responsibility, would burn a forest to light one chandelier. And for me, Claire, wounded not broken, learns quietly, bends without snapping, will hold the house even after the fire. My throat tightened. He didn't need anyone to validate him, Lucille said, echoing the words he had told her that final week. He said, I don't need them to know who I am. I need Claire to remember. I stared at her. And you? Why didn't you tell me? She sighed, because he asked me not to. Until they showed you what they really were. He knew they would. I reached into the box again, retrieving the USB. What's this? Her face shifted. A recording. Family meeting last year, early spring. He asked me to place a voice recorder under the buffet table. Said he wanted evidence. I gripped it tighter. Evidence of what Lucille hesitated, then met my eyes. What Evelyn said, while she thought he was asleep in the study. I didn't breathe. She said Claire was never part of the plan. She's a 30-year mistake we're still cleaning up. Something inside me went still. Lucille placed a hand on mine. You don't have to use it. But if you do know this, they won't just fight back. They'll try to destroy you. Your reputation, your work, your name. I looked down at the metal stick still warm from her hand. They already tried, I said. All they did was sharpen me. Lucille gave a faint smile. Then take it. He left it for you. She stood slowly and walked to the kitchen, leaving me alone in the golden light USB in hand, the tin box open before me like a map back to the truth. I didn't know yet what I would do with the recording, but I knew exactly where I'd play it first. You're making a spectacle, Franklin spat. I smiled. No, I'm showing them the truth. You're the spectacle. The studio lights bore down with a heat that made sweat bloom along my collarbone, but my voice stayed steady. Across from me, the host of Money and Legacy, Meredith Knox, leaned forward with the sharpness of a woman who could smell blood through a screen. We were live. Behind the cameras, producers gestured silently while teleprompters scrolled scripts Meredith never used. She didn't need them. She was known for going off script, and tonight I was the target. Or so they thought. Claire Hawthorne, she said crisp. The internet has dubbed you the burned heiress. She let the words hang, savoring them. What does that feel like? I didn't flinch. Accurate. Just not in the way they think. A murmur rippled through the control room. I didn't lose anything that day, I continued. They only revealed what they thought I was worth. A beat. Meredith tilted her head. And what do you think you're worth? That depends, I said, gaze steady, on whether truth has any value left. A screen behind us lit up with a still image me at the boardroom table, the manila folder front and center. The segment had been running for 43 hours straight across social platforms. Hundreds of thousands of views, commentaries, satire, outrage. Carlton joined via video call, his face framed in tasteful darkness. All documents presented at the meeting are verifiable and filed with the Connecticut State Register, effective, binding, and lawful. Meredith pounced. But your family says otherwise. Your brother, your mother. They can say what they like, I said. So can I. She leaned back just slightly. Speaking of your mother. The screen changed again. Audio played grainy at first, then clearer. Claire was never part of the plan. She's a 30-year mistake we're still cleaning up. Gasps. No one moved. Even Meredith didn't blink. That recording, she said after a beat, is from a private meeting. Held at my grandfather's estate, I replied calmly. Recorded and stored with full awareness by Mr. Everett Hawthorne in the care of his domestic staff. Carlton added, time-stamped, authenticated, and retained at the request of the deceased. It is legally admissible and has not been tampered with. A long silence stretched. Then Meredith turned back to me. Some people say this is revenge. I gave a small smile. Then they misunderstand the difference between revenge and record-keeping. Her eyes narrowed. Let's say they accept you're the legal heir, you hold the contracts, the voice of the man who built the empire. What now? That was the moment I'd been waiting for. If you hold the legacy, she said, voice low, what will you do with it? I didn't blink. Restore its name, I said. Not inherit the shame. The audience behind the cameras erupted not into applause, but into the kind of breathless silence that felt heavier than sound. Meredith sat back, eyes unreadable, fingers steepled. "You've planned this well," she said finally. "No," I said. "He did. I'm just finishing the sentence." The interview cut to commercial. When I stepped outside, the air was cold and full of city noise. A street light flickered overhead. My phone vibrated. Unknown number. I stared for a second, then answered. Evelyn's voice came sharp, low, venomous. "This ends now." I said nothing. "Meet me. Alone." She gave the address, then hung up. "You've made your point," Evelyn said, sliding a glass across the table. "Now name your price." The restaurant was the kind the Hawthorns used for damage control, quiet, discreet, with soundproofed walls, and a wine list older than the country itself. We sat in the private room, far from the murmurs of other diners. The only light came from a chandelier above, casting a gold sheen over the linen and the crystal, and the woman who had spent most of my life shaping me into a version of herself and resenting me when I refused. I didn't touch the wine. She had ordered for me without asking. Still remembered my preferences, or thought she did. I figured this would be more civilized than another press leak, she said, offering a tight smile. "You've been busy." "I've been honest," I said, folding my hands in my lap. "There's a difference." Evelyn tilted her head. "Truth is elastic, darling. And legacy." She trailed off, sipping her own drink. "Legacy is a group performance, not a solo act." She leaned forward slightly. "We can still fix this. A joint statement. Something elegant. You admit there were memory gaps, that you misunderstood the legalities, that perhaps grief clouded your judgment." I stared, and in return I asked. "You're reinstated. We present a united family. You'll be the face of our new wellness initiative. Press tours, foundations, graceful forgiveness." She said, her voice as smooth as silk cut on glass. "Everyone wins. Everyone but the truth." I said nothing. "You always wanted too much," she said after a pause. "Even as a child, you asked why when you should have curtsied." "Do you remember what I told you that night before your first recital?" I did. She continued anyway. "They don't need to know you're right. They only need to see you bow. That's the role, the one you were born into." "I wasn't born into this," I said softly. "I was shaped to survive it." Evelyn's smile tightened. "Everett didn't believe in survival. He believed in strategy. You never quite understood that." I held her gaze. I understood him perfectly. Her fingers tapped the edge of the glass. "Then you'll understand this too. We raised you. We can erase you." It slipped out too sharp, too fast. But her expression didn't change. If anything, she looked lighter, like she'd finally said the thing she'd always meant. I reached into my coat pocket and placed a small recording device on the table between us. It blinked red once, then went still. "Funny," I said. "I already did the opposite." Her face drained of color. "I thought this was a negotiation," I added. "Turns out it's just another confession." She reached for the recorder, but I was faster. Back in my coat. Locked. Done. "You shouldn't have come here," she said, ice threading through her voice now. "You invited me." Her voice lowered. "You won't win." "I don't have to," I said. "I just have to let everyone else see you lose." She stood too fast, knocking her chair slightly. The server appeared in the doorway, alarmed. Evelyn waved him off, recomposing herself like a statue sliding back into place. "I was right to keep you out," she hissed, grabbing her bag. Even Everett saw it at the end. "Is that what he told you?" I asked. She didn't answer. As she stormed out, the air felt warmer, lighter. I sat for another minute before my phone buzzed. "Carlton, the second clause activates tonight. You ready?" I stared at the message for a moment, then typed back. "Claire, let's bring it home." They thought they burned everything Carlton said, sliding the file over. But he hid the fuse in the fine print. Clause 37 wasn't dramatic. It wasn't bolded or underlined. Just 4 lines of precise language buried on page 17 of the master will, right between provisions about archival preservation and philanthropic allocations. But it burned hotter than any match Evelyn had struck. Carlton tapped it once with his pen. Executed, witnessed, filed, and now triggered. We sat in a private conference room at Barnett and Ellison, a firm known for its discretion and its fireproof vaults. Around the table were two neutral attorneys, one from the state's bar and another from the oversight board. Across from me sat a woman in a navy suit with a name tag that read Elena Rhodes, Director Haven Bridge Foundation. She looked at me not with sympathy, but with curiosity, and maybe something else respect. "I'll read it aloud," Carlton said, though I already knew every word. "In the event that my appointed heir, Claire Hawthorne, is publicly defamed or stripped of dignity by members of my family or their agents via action word or orchestrated media effort, the undersigned heir shall have the authority to dissolve the Hawthorne estate and reallocate all financial and material assets to a third-party charitable entity of her choosing." Carlton looked up. He called it the scorched earth clause. But politely. I felt the weight of it then. Not the power, the burden. Did he know, I asked quietly, that they'd do this? He didn't guess, Carlton said. He remembered. Elena folded her hands. "Ms. Hawthorne, has such an event occurred? Do you assert that defamation has taken place?" I nodded once. "Yes, the footage of my mother and brother destroying a personal bequest, their recorded statements, the public campaign to frame me as unstable, unworthy. That meets the threshold." The attorneys conferred in murmurs. Then one asked, "Do you wish to activate Clause 37 in full?" I looked at the file in front of me. Everything the Hawthornes had built. Properties, trusts, holdings, the estate. The legacy they'd tried to keep in a sealed room with curated narratives and velvet ropes. They wanted to own the name, not the meaning. "If they won't honor his name," I said, uncapping the pen, "I'll give it to people who will." I signed. The second attorney dated it. Carlton initialed. Elena accepted the documents with a solemn nod. "We'll begin the transfer process immediately. A public notice will be filed by noon tomorrow. And thank you." I didn't smile, not yet. There was still the matter of the explosion. When I stepped outside, my phone was already ringing. Franklin. I let it ring once, twice before answering. His voice was strained. "What are you doing?" I stood under the overhang, watching rain begin to mist against the streetlights. "Fixing what you shattered," I said. He didn't respond at first. "Then you'd destroy it all." "For what revenge?" "No," I said. "To remind people what legacy is supposed to mean." He went quiet again. I didn't wait for a goodbye. I hung up and turned my face into the rain. It felt clean. Tomorrow, the world would know. Not that I had inherited power, but that I had chosen where to place it. "You're giving it all away?" the journalist asked, stunned. I smiled. "They gave me ash. I'm giving back the forest." The room went still. Sunlight filtered through the tall windows of the Haven Bridge Foundation's conference center, casting long lines across the hardwood floor. Every seat was filled. Some faces I recognized: editors, board members, reporters, who'd once dismissed me with polite indifference. Others were strangers, their expressions a mix of curiosity and disbelief. Behind me stood the directors of 3 nonprofit organizations: education, healthcare, housing, all dressed plainly grounded, looking more stunned than triumphant. The podium mic squeaked softly as I adjusted it. Then I spoke. "My grandfather was not a perfect man," I began, "but he was a purposeful one. He believed wealth should not be a wall, it should be a foundation. Not something you guard, but something you build with." A photo of Everett Hawthorne lit up the screen behind me. Gray hair, swept back eyes, full of conviction, not vanity. It was the one I'd chosen. The one they never framed in the estate. "He left me with more than money," I continued. "He left me with clarity. And with it, a responsibility." Carlton was watching from a secure link somewhere in his law office across the city. I could almost feel his approval through the blinking light on the livestream panel. I opened the manila folder. "These are the formal documents finalizing the transfer of all assets placed under my stewardship. Effective today, the estate will be divided between the Hawthorne Education Endowment, the Green Branch Medical Trust, and the Evergreen Housing Fund. Nothing will return to the family that disowned its own roots." The murmurs grew louder. Questions formed on lips, cameras zoomed in, pens hovered. A woman near the front, blonde, young, clearly new to this beat, stood. "But Ms. Hawthorne, you're not keeping any of it." I looked her in the eye. "I kept what matters," I said. "The rest is noise." I held up the faded letter, my grandfather's script still legible. He warned me they'd try to reduce everything to showmanship, to stagecraft. He told me not to fight with fire, but with foundation. And so I have. A beat of silence. Then two people stood. Then more. Applause. Not roaring, not explosive, but steady, earnest. They weren't clapping for me. They were clapping for the man who had taught me to leave no bridges burning, only built. I stepped away from the podium. No interviews, no sound bites. I nodded once to the camera, then disappeared behind the curtain. By evening, my name was trending again, but this time attached to scholarship programs, mobile clinics, housing projects, not heiress, builder. I declined all follow-up invitations, late-night shows, profiles, speeches. I didn't need any of it. My part was done. The city was quiet by the time I returned home, and then a knock. Not loud, not urgent. I opened the door to find Franklin standing in the hallway. No suit, no entourage. Just a man holding his coat too tightly and looking like someone who finally saw the ruin he helped build. I should have stood up earlier, he said, voice rough. So had I. So had we all. We started at this table, I said. Fitting that we end here. No cameras, no notepads. Just wood polished to a hollow shine and the ghosts of every silent dinner we'd ever had. The long oak table in the Hawthorne dining room gleamed beneath the chandelier. Every seat was filled the first time in years. Evelyn at the head, as always. Robert to her left, Carlton beside me. Franklin, silent, sat where I used to as a child, one seat down from my mother, always in her shadow, though he never noticed. I had chosen this room carefully, not the salon, not the office. This room held the memory of discipline disguised as etiquette, of being cut down with a glance over soup. I placed a slim folder on the table. These, I said calmly, are the executed transfers of all Hawthorne assets once held in my name. As of noon yesterday, the holdings have been formally and irrevocably reassigned to public trusts. Carlton didn't speak, just slid notarized duplicates across the table to each person. The seal glinted like a verdict. Evelyn's hand trembled as she reached for hers. You didn't have to do this, she said, voice small, for the first time I could remember. I didn't. I agreed. I chose to. Robert narrowed his eyes. And what do you expect from us, now? Gratitude, guilt. Nothing, I said. Because for once, I'm not here to take anything. I'm here to end something. I looked each of them in the eye. You've lost nothing, I continued. You never considered it mine. Not the name, not the value. You burned my inheritance thinking it was symbolic. You made your choice publicly, viciously. So I made mine, legally. Carlton cleared his throat. All relevant contracts have been filed with the court and the Department of Charitable Oversight, he said. There is no recourse, no appeal, no clawback. Any attempt to litigate will be summarily dismissed. Clause 37 was upheld under state law. Franklin exhaled audibly. Then slowly he stood. His voice was low, the words careful, as if he wasn't sure his mouth knew how to form them. I was wrong, he said. I should have stopped them. I should have said something. I didn't. He looked at me. I'm sorry. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then Evelyn pushed back her chair too fast, the legs scraping against the floor. Her eyes were brimming the corners of her mouth, twitching rage or grief, I couldn't tell. She opened her mouth, closed it, and began to cry. Not loud, not desperate, just quiet sobs muffled behind one trembling hand. I didn't look away. I just reached into my coat pocket and pulled out a thin, crumpled fragment, charred, brittle. A corner of the original check. You burned this, I said, laying it gently on the center of the table. I kept it, as a reminder of who you thought I was. Silence. Pure and total. I stood. This house isn't mine. Never was. But what he gave me, what he believed I could become, that's mine. And I've built something with it. Carlton rose beside me. I've seen a lot of exits in this line of work, he murmured. But never one with this much dignity. As I walked out of the dining room, the echo of my heels following me like punctuation, I felt something lift. Not forgiveness, not peace, but finality. And sometimes, that's enough. They burned the check. I inherited the legacy. The front page said it all. Heiress destroys 1110M dynasty to save a name. It ran beneath a photo of me locking the gates to Hawthorne Estate for the last time, not smiling, not triumphant. Just steady hands closed around rusted iron and something quieter than victory. The media called it audacious. Others called it reckless. But no one called it weak. That morning, Carlton sent me a short text. You rewrote the ending. Proud to have witnessed it. By noon, Franklin's resignation hit the headlines. Every financial network ran with the quote from his statement, "I failed to protect my sister when it mattered." This is my attempt to start correcting that. No spin, no damage control. Just 7 lines of pure reckoning. I read it over 3 times, stunned not by the words, but that they had finally come from his mouth. By mid-afternoon, I received the envelope. It was pale cream, handwritten, the Hawthorne seal pressed faintly into the flap. My name spelled in cursive, familiar but cautious. Inside 2 pages. Claire, I never understood you. I still don't. But I no longer blame you. Perhaps the things your grandfather saw in you were real. Perhaps I was wrong to measure legacy only in terms of control. You did what you believed was right, and you didn't flinch. I won't be returning to the estate. I've already arranged for my departure. There are things I need to face in private. I ask nothing of you, but I give you this silence. And peace. E. I folded the letter and set it beside my teacup. No tears came. No anger either. Just a strange hollowing, a space where the war had lived for too long. At dusk, I stood at the door of the estate for the final time. The official handover to the Havenbridge Foundation would take place tomorrow, but I wanted to walk it alone one last time as Claire Hawthorne, the girl who'd once believed her name could protect her. Now I knew better. Names didn't protect us. People did. I moved through the halls in silence. The library, the study, the winter garden where he used to sit with me and show me how roots outlived blossoms. I paused at the stained glass window on the staircase, sunlight barely catching the edges. Downstairs, the director of the foundation waited. This place is more than walls, I told her. It taught me everything, what not to become, what to build from nothing. Use it for more than just lessons. Make it into a beginning. She held out her hand. I pressed the old brass key into her palm and closed her fingers around it. It's yours now, I said. His, really. Always was. We stepped out together. As the door clicked shut behind us, it felt like something else had finally locked with it. The wind stirred slightly as we approached the gates, and then Claire. I turned. Lucille, wrapped in her green shawl, walked slowly up the path. She hadn't aged in the ways the others had. Her back was still straight, her gaze clear. She didn't speak right away, just came to me and wrapped me in an embrace that smelled of lavender and flower and Sunday mornings. Her voice trembled against my shoulder. He always knew you'd do it, just like this. I clung to her without shame. I had nothing left to prove, no one to perform for, just one truth to carry with me. Ashes couldn't burn what had already taken root. You're the girl who gave up millions, the journalist asked. No, I replied. I'm the woman who took something priceless back. I never responded to the email, or the follow-up, or the one after that with the promise of a 7-figure book deal and a ghostwriter who had handled scandals with sensitivity. I didn't need to control the narrative. I'd already rewritten it. Instead, I replied with a single line. I'm not the story. The story is what happens when we stop believing their version. It was late fall in Vermont. The trees almost bare their branches like ribs exposed to the sky. I sipped my coffee by the window of a small cafe tucked between a bookstore and a bike shop. Behind me, soft laughter rose from a group of girls crammed around a second-hand laptop working on scholarship applications for next year's finance track. They weren't Hawthorns. They weren't heirs to anything but grit. And that's why I showed up every Thursday at 4 p.m. to teach them how not to get burned by contracts, by systems, by people who saw them as currency instead of capacity. One girl, Maya 12, smarter than she realized, stayed behind after class. Can I ask something, she said, hugging her frayed backpack. Anything. She kicked at the leg of the chair. Were you ever bullied? I blinked. Yes, I said slowly. More than once. But I learned something. What I smiled. It doesn't have to happen again. Not to me, and not to you. She nodded thoughtful, then hugged me before darting out the door, scarf flapping behind her like a flag. I stayed seated, letting the warmth of her question settle around me. That simple word bullied was a child's way of naming betrayal, of naming what people do when they have power and no compass. Above the whiteboard back at the center, I'd hung a framed photo. My grandfather, mid-laugh, reaching across a chessboard to knock over his own king. You win, he'd told 10-year-old me, though I was still 2 moves from checkmate. The caption below read, "The game's not about winning. It's about what you learn when you lose." The girls read it every week. Some of them didn't understand it yet. But one day, they would. One day they'd carry that same lesson into boardrooms or bedrooms or ballots, and no one would dare hand them ash with a smile. Back at my small apartment, I placed my keys in the bowl by the door and walked to the desk. The old wooden box still sat there polished, now its hinges oiled. Inside weren't legal papers or contracts or hidden clauses. Just letters, new ones. Each dated, sealed, and addressed to a woman I was still becoming. Some began with, "Dear Claire, today was hard." Others said, "You didn't break, and that's enough." There was one I hadn't sealed yet. It ended with this: "You could have demanded the world's attention. Instead, you chose its silence. That's how I know you finally found yourself." As I closed the lid, I glanced at the small ceramic dish on the corner of the desk. Still resting there unchanged by time was a brittle fragment of charred paper, the edge of a check that once represented everything they thought they'd taken from me. They hadn't. They never even knew where to look. I could write them 1,000 things, I thought. But what's the point, if they never listened? When I was in the room, snow tapped gently against the window pane, a quiet rhythm like a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The fire in the stone hearth crackled, casting long shadows across the pinewood walls. My cabin sat at the edge of a ridge in Vermont, far from the marble and mirrors of the world I used to belong to. Tonight, the table in front of me wasn't covered in contracts or press clippings. Just paper, ink, a chipped mug of tea, and the weight of memory. I picked up the pen. "Dear Evelyn, you taught me silence. You taught it in the way your lips tightened when I spoke too freely. In the way you nodded to guests while your hand gripped mine beneath the table, hard enough to bruise. In the way you looked through me when Franklin spoke over me, and you said, 'Let him finish, Claire.' Your silence became mine. But unlike you, I learned to wield it like a blade. Not to cut, but to protect. You thought silence meant obedience. I turned it into witness. You never knew the difference." I set it aside, breathing slower now. Another sheet. Another truth. "Dear Robert, you were the blueprint of control. You measured success in assets, in lineage, in name. I once thought, if I earned your respect, I'd be safe. But you taught me that legacy has nothing to do with love, that a daughter's voice can be quieter than the rustling of stock papers on your desk. So I did the one thing you could never comprehend. I rewrote the legacy, without needing to win your love. And still, I don't hate you. I just stopped needing you." I felt the sting of these words long after they left the pen. One more. "Franklin, you were the only one who could have stood beside me, the only one whose voice might have reached them. But you didn't use it. You used mine instead, echoed my ideas, wore them like your own, then grinned when the applause came. Maybe one day you'll stop chasing ghosts in expensive shoes. Maybe you'll see that the approval you crave was never yours to earn because you were always enough, just not to them. That's something I learned too, the hard way." The ink on each page shimmered faintly in the firelight. I folded the 3 letters slow and careful, like tucking away grief. Then I rose and walked to the hearth. For a long moment I held the stack over the flame, my hand steady. Then I let go. The paper curled, darkened, then lifted into sparks, 3 small ghosts finally allowed to vanish. I didn't cry. I didn't smile. I just watched until all that was left was ash and silence. Back at the table, I reached for a final page. "Dear Claire, 10 years from now, you might not remember every detail. You might forget the way Vermont smells in February, or how the snow looked at dusk, or how the pen felt in your hand when you wrote this. But I hope you remember this: you stayed. When they tried to erase you, you refused to disappear. You didn't become who they needed, you became who you were meant to be. And that's a legacy no one can burn. I didn't fold this one. I placed it gently into the wooden box beside the others next to the ashes of a check they thought was everything. As I closed the lid, the wind outside picked up, but inside the cabin, the stillness was finally mine. And in the quiet, I whispered to the girl they tried to erase, "Thank you." They thought they burned my inheritance, but what they lit was the fire I needed to become free. The whiteboard behind me gleamed in the late afternoon sun, the words written in blue marker still bold: "Financial clarity is a human right." It wasn't a slogan, not really. It was the compass that had guided me out of the wreckage. The classroom was modest 4 walls, scuffed linoleum folding chairs that creaked when people leaned back. But for me, it felt grander than any boardroom I'd ever been locked out of. These walls didn't echo with legacy, they pulsed with potential. Evie raised her hand. She was maybe 10 with curly brown hair tied into 2 tight buns, her eyes wide and unfiltered. She was here with her aunt, a woman in her 30s trying to rebuild after leaving a toxic marriage. The kid just tagged along, but she always sat in the front, always asked questions. "Miss Claire," she said, blinking, "did you ever lose?" The room stilled. A few of the adults smiled nervously, waiting to see how I'd answer. "Yes," I said without hesitation, "more times than I can count." Evie tilted her head. "Then how come you're here teaching us?" I leaned against the edge of the desk, arms crossed lightly. "Because I stopped letting them decide when the game ends." That got a few nods. I saw recognition flicker across faces that had known their own kinds of fire: divorces, layoffs, custody battles, debts that whispered every time they opened their mail. We all knew what it meant to lose. The real lesson today wasn't in Roth IRAs or budgeting techniques. It was in reclaiming narrative. I flipped open my notebook, scribbled a few figures, circled a number that would have made my father scoff at its modesty, but it was the savings goal of a woman in the back row who had just opened her first bank account in 5 years. Behind the numbers, we were rebuilding sovereignty. That's what they never understood, the ones who lit the match and smiled. They thought power came from possession. They never saw that letting go could be its own form of ownership. At the end of class, as the group began to trickle out, one of the students lingered to ask about refinancing options. Another needed help filling out a FAFSA form for her son. I stayed until the last question was answered. When the door finally closed and silence settled again, I sat down and opened the journal I kept tucked beneath the lesson plans. Just one line today. I never needed the check. I only needed the choice. Outside, snow had begun to fall lightly. The sun dipped low, casting long slats of gold through the classroom windows. I rose and gathered my things, slipping on my coat. Before stepping out, I turned to glance at the room one last time. The chairs were empty now, but in the filtered glow of the winter dusk, I could almost imagine someone still sitting in the back row, hands folded, smile, soft eyes, knowing. Maybe it was just a trick of the light. Or maybe, just maybe, some legacies don't die. They evolve. Quietly. Intentionally. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like I needed to prove anything to anyone. I stepped outside into the evening, letting the door shut gently behind me. The wind nipped at my cheeks, but I smiled anyway, because I wasn't walking away from something. I was walking into everything I had chosen. They thought they'd silenced me with ash, but every ember became a page in the story they couldn't control. I didn't need to win in court or on headlines. I just needed to reclaim the right to choose who I'd become. Justice didn't roar. It whispered through every quiet decision I made to no longer be their victim. When injustice is met with clarity and resolve, even legacies built on lies begin to tremble. So maybe this isn't just my story. Maybe it's yours too. Like, share, and comment your thoughts. Type 1 if you felt seen. Type 2 if something didn't sit right. Let's talk.